Okay, so this is from the early 1400s in Japan. There was a sensei called the Crazy Cloud. It was Ikkyu. Once Ikkyu was taking the Yodo no Kaze ferry on his way to Sakai. There was Yamabushi, an ascetic hermit on board, who began to question him. "Hey, your reverence, what sect are you?" "I belong to the Zen sect," replied Ikkyu. "I don't suppose your sect has miracles the way our sect does." "No, actually, we have lots of miracles. But if it's miracles, why don't you show the sort of miracles your people have?" "Well," said Yamabushi, "by virtue of my magic powers, I can pray up a scary celestial Fudo between your very eyes and make him stand right there on the prow of the boat." And with the beads of his rosary, the man began to invoke first fearsome Kongo and then horrible Setaka. At this, all the passengers began to look back and forth, wondering what was going to happen. Then, just as he had said, there on the prow of the boat, the form of terrifying Fudo appeared, surrounded by a halo of dancing flames. Then Yamabushi made a ferocious face and told them, "You'd all better offer him a prayer." This made other passengers very uneasy. All that is but Ikkyu, who was completely unruffled. "Well," spat the Yamabushi, "how about you, Zen monk? How are you going to deal with my miracle?" "By producing a miracle of my own. From my very body, I will cause water to issue forth and extinguish the flames of your Fudo. You'd better start your prayers again." And Ikkyu began to pee mightily all over the flames until at last the Yamabushi's magic was counteracted and the entire image melted away. Thereupon, the passengers of the boat all bowed to Ikkyu for his wonderful display. Hello, everybody. In my time here sharing these things called sermons, I produced a chuckle or two. Usually, though, the chuckles are loudest when I'm funny without trying. In other words, I do something so awkward that you'll just laugh at me. This is therefore sure to be the world's most flat-footed, awkward sermon ever preached in the pulpit. What does the word human, humility, humor all have in common? Earth. When we touch these earthy things, we put things in perspective. The boundaries between sadness and laughter, reverence and profanity become razor thin. They fold into one another abruptly. Sacred space is called a thin space, so therefore humor and its thinness, sacred. That's what I like about this Japanese reading. I mean, you can't get any more earthy than the thought of a holy monk whipping out his Johnson in front of everyone and giving a little holy sprinkle to a fearsome, half-demonic spiritual being conjured by the prayers of a supposedly even more holy mind. And what is a miracle? Right? What is reverence? What is kindness? What is it? Every so often I get into, peeing matches with my fellow clergy. I mean, I was riding my motorcycle the other day with this fellow clergy friend of mine named Dan. He's an evangelical, but we both love our bikes, and that's something. So we've got our wireless earbuds, and he calls me up while we're rumbling along the tarmac, and he says, "Hey, Vern, you believe in hell?" I just laughed, and I said, "Hell no." And I've been thinking about it. He says, sometimes I wonder, well, if I wasn't an evangelical and I didn't believe in hell, what would keep me from knocking you over on the road, leaving you for dead, and stealing your wallet? There might have been a little silence after that. We leaned into the corner of the row. We went up over a little rise by a farm and a field with tall gold grass contrasting the bluish snow. And then it came to me, Dan, if you were you, that thought would have never occurred to you. It's easy to poke fun at other clergy, but to do that, I've got to be willing to do the same for myself. You know, sometimes when I'm at a party and no one really knows who I am, and they ask me what I do for a living, and I say something like this, well, I belong to the second oldest profession. What is the second oldest profession? They say, well, at the beginning, according to the archaeological remains of the oldest temples, the first and the second profession were really the same thing. I'm a priest and so much more. Though it may appear that I have it all together up here, and it's true, there are many hoops, and still more hoops to go through as I transition from UCC to the UUA, but I recently discovered that I have failed my way to this position as much as I have earned my way here. The other day, I ran across an unusual little assignment in our small group Soul Matters curriculum on resilience. Write a failure resume. Failure resume. I thought, are you kidding me? You're going to write a failure resume and share this with a group? So anyway, I didn't think much more of the assignment until I had to go to the meeting and I realized I hadn't done the work, and therefore I had to do what I had read that far, and that was the failure resume part, so I shared my failure resume. So I'm going to share a little bit of mine, not what I really shared with the group, because what was said in the group stays secret, right? So here goes. My grandfather, Frank Wright III, was great at math and was a successful engineer, and he had 80 engineers that he employed full-time at his firm. And my dad, Frank IV, well, he was also great at math, and he worked time to time with the engineering firm. And when I was very young, there were some whispers that maybe number 5 would also be great at math and work at my grandfather's firm one day. But I was not great at math. I mean, I was similar to a lot of my friends who were great at math, were able to do it all in their head, and I could do the same thing, except for when I put it onto paper, it would all come up backwards and upside down. It was frustrating. My head would start heating up in math class, and I thought I would spontaneously explode. Everybody would say, oh, look, Vern's having an aneurysm again. What kind of Wright couldn't do math? Fortunately, my mom was an artist, and I was way better at art. So I failed into becoming an artist. The next thing I failed at was being popular. You know what's really fun? Live in a media-saturated culture that loves sports and red meat and conformity, and have your kid have no access to TV or electricity, and make sure he knows nothing about sports except for maybe fencing or track and field or swimming, and make him a vegetarian, and make all of his clothes by hand from folkaway patterns. I mean, it's hilarious. He'll be like walking around like an alien from another planet in the school, only no one has really heard about aliens in Jaffrey, New Hampshire. They'll just call him retarded. Well, that was me. But you know what happened? I got really nerdy about a few sports I didn't know about, and I got good at them. And I also got really into art with a couple of other people, had similar interests, and we became good friends. And I failed my way into being a part of the boutique sports world of cross-country skiing and fencing, and becoming a part of an artist cooperative as a teenager. The next thing I failed at was becoming an Olympic skier or wanting to ski ever again. After I lost my temper at a cross-country ski event for the final time, I was already known as the John McEnroe of the Nordic skiing world, and I was greatly respected for it. I mean, there's nothing more ennobling than throwing a temper tantrum wearing a skin-tight Lycra bodysuit. But that day I was done. I couldn't bear to look at my teammates in the face anymore. And surprise, surprise, all the funding for my college just kind of dried up. Who knew that being a D1 athlete could have such consequence? This did enable me to eventually transfer to the University of Colorado Boulder, where I was able to become a comparative religious studies major. I failed into a BA religious studies at CU Boulder. The next thing I failed at was being a boarding school teacher. I mean, how do you find employment after earning a bachelor's of art in religious studies anyway? You become a private boarding school teacher. That's what you do. I became a private boarding school English composition, public speaking, English as a second language teacher. The problem was my son Owen was born with CF, and I had to miss a lot of work because we were in hospital pretty much for a straight month, my first month's teaching. And I got the kindest note in my mailbox one day that said, due to philosophical difference, we will not be renewing your contract next year. I passed the headmaster in the hall one day and I said, you know, when I took Philosophy 101, I never became acquainted with the philosopher who inspired the world with the phrase, thou shalt not employ teachers with sick kids. But you're right. In my philosophy, I've learned that it's best for one's health not to work for bastards. I didn't really know what I was going to do next. That's when my mother-in-law, who was a devoted Episcopalian, said, have you ever considered the priesthood? Of course, I didn't know about Episcopalians, and I was thinking only of Catholic priests, and I began to wonder if my mother-in-law really thought I was right for her daughter. After seminary, I did become a congregational minister, and I went pretty well for a couple of decades, but I eventually failed at that too. You ready for a great Congregationalist joke? You know what's funny about Congregationalists? They founded your state and your town. Congregationalists are super fun-loving people who brought you the ever-lovable Boston Brahmin. And this is good old Boston, the home of the bean and the cod, where the Lowells talk only to the Cabots, and the Cabots talk only to God. Actually, the Cabots became Unitarians, though. After serving Second Church for 12 years, I decided to serve as a wealthy South Shore congregation looking for a progressive. I was loved by the search committee, and the church had me candidate. It seemed such like a great church. But my first Sunday was the first Sunday of the nationwide COVID lockdown. Ever heard about this thing called social capital? Turns out it's super important if you're a minister. My sermon after the January 6th incident, intimating that President Trump's action on that day were less than American, went over so well. Though the search committee and the executive board were made up of committed liberals, it turned out that most of the church budget was comprised of a few arch-conservative families who were the head of the Trump campaign in town. Here's a little secret. It's true, nobody chooses the ministry. Ministry chooses them. A slightly disingenuous way of putting it is that it's called a calling. But I found it more like you're wandering around and you notice you're on this very broad path, barely noticeable at first, and then pretty soon it's a dirt road, and then it's a highway, and then it's a railroad. And you're on a railroad, and you're like, I'm on a railroad. And then you realize that it's a roller coaster. And it's an old roller coaster that's about ready to fall apart. And it's going around a loop-de-loop, and it's shaking on you. In this case, my carriage came to an abrupt halt, and I was exited from the ride. Yeah, it was pretty bad. The problem was I no longer had faith that I could lead as a minister. Clearly, in the church that I had been serving, the minister was owned by the deep-pocketed and was supposed to serve only them. But I had failed in other ways, too. At one point, a parishioner said, "Why do you always talk about other religions in your sermons?" I don't care about those other religions. Just stick to the Bible. I felt like saying something I can't say here. After all, this is not a New York pulpit. But I didn't say that. I said, I'll make sure I'm more mindful in the future. It was about that time I started having coffee with my UU colleague down the street. Now that's mindfulness. I went back into search, of course, in the UCC world. Eventually, I was a final candidate for a small elderly church with a $7 million endowment in Newton. I wasn't happy about having to go there. I wondered what new wealthy jerk I would have to serve. That's when your former minister, Gretchen Weiss, called me up. "Vern, are you still in search?" "Not much longer, I'm afraid." "Why?" "Would you possibly consider doing some interim work here at Murray? We can't find an interim and you'd be a good fit." And you know what? I've never been happier. I love it here. But I failed my way to you. It's all a big joke. It's all very funny. But laughing is very good medicine for the soul. If we can laugh ourselves together, we can grow together. We can be resilient together. We can succeed together. We can be true together. If we can't tell jokes, if we can't point to this earthy earth we are all standing on together, how can we look up and see the sky and realize that this is wonderfully one and whole, and there's no such thing as hell, just fellow motorcyclists enjoying this road with us with a few bad, sometimes scary ideas. Let us at least laugh together and point to this earth that we all share. That way we will be standing on the truth. Brutality is always on one level ridiculous, and we will pee on that Fudo all day long. Pointing to it and calling it out is always going to be persuasive. If not for the country as a whole, at least for this small island of sanity. But if that doesn't work and this Constitution of ours truly has become worthless in the onward march of the oligarchs, you know what? This island can move. Even this nation isn't so big a force that we can't put it on our collective failure resume and fail upward together into some brighter future. We have to remember that no matter what, we are a resilient people. Always have been. Peace and love, everybody.